Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jen Hicks. I'm the Director of Communications and Outreach with Maine Woodland Owners. We're a nonprofit organization with nearly 3,000 members. We provide the resources and expertise for small woodland owners that are looking to manage and care for their woods. Today's program is Setting Your Woodland Objectives with Jeff Williams. And Jeff is a consulting forester. He's also one of our board members of Maine Woodland Owners. We also have Tom Allen here, who's a board member. He's here as a participant, but I wanted to acknowledge that we have another board member. We may have a few more arriving. So this is a universal topic. And I think that the point of this is that we have, excuse me, let me just get that. That the point of this is that even if you've owned your woods for many years, that everybody's interested in talking about objectives, revisiting objectives, and keeping objectives as relevant and as current as possible. So we're glad to have a wide range of people with different levels of experience. Jeff today is going to drill down on areas that all woodland owners should be focused on when it comes to developing objectives, and they stem from your goals you've set for your woods, which are pretty much what's on your mind when you're buying woods initially. So this is also a program for the participants to jump in, ask questions, and provide some insight based on your own experiences. So I know Jeff's open to having some dialogue throughout the program. He has a great slideshow. We're going to go through it, but at any point, if anybody has questions or want to jump in to get some clarification or just add to the point that Jeff is making, please feel free to do that. There's a few ways you can go ahead and do that. One is to type in your question in the chat box. I will be monitoring that throughout the program. You can also turn on your video and you can just hold up your hand. I'll be looking for people who are doing that as well, and I'll allow them to jump in and ask the question. And there's also, if you look, there is a hand raise indicator that you can use on Zoom. Some people know how to do that. Others may find that a little cumbersome. That's fine. Raising your hand on the video is just as good as having the raised hand indicator up as well. Also, just jumping in is fine. I think we have a small enough group that we can do this. It's going to be a nice casual, like I said, a dialogue-based program. So I think those are all the things I wanted to discuss before we started. So at this point, we can jump in with Jeff. Jeff, I do want to say a quick introduction. Besides being a consulting forester, he's also written for Maine Woodlands, which is our newsletter with our organization. And he's actually written a series of articles for people who are starting out thinking about managing their woods or maybe making some new choices for their woods. So I really encourage you, if you're a member and you have access to our members page, you have access to our newsletter archive, and you can find Jeff's articles in there as well. And he's done these programs before. So we have a new woodland owner page on our website that you can access, and you can find some videos of Jeff and Tom Doak have also presented some information around this area of focus. So there's a lot of resources for you beyond this program, and I just encourage you to tap them when you have time. Okay, Jeff, the floor is yours.
Sure. So hi, everybody. My name is Jeff Williams. I'm consultant down in Leamington in York County. I have been doing it for about a decade now. And the first slide you're looking at, just to give you a little perspective, I specialize in invasive plant management. So you're looking at a stand that is, I believe it is Freiburg, or just on the edge of Freiburg, that we were doing some invasive work and doing some white pine release and hardwood sprout control. So this is a landowner who has very clear objectives. They've been working on their property for quite some time. They know exactly what they want out of it, and we're going step by step to achieve those results. So I just wanted to throw that picture in. Is this can go anywhere from, I want trails in my woodlot, and that's my main focus, all the way up to I want this certain stand composition, basal area, yada yada, forestry terms, etc. So it doesn't have to be real pinned down when it comes to figuring out and focusing on your objectives, because a lot of times they'll change over time. As you get into different stages of management, different stages of life even, and different things happen around you, you'll probably change your focus throughout your ownership. So we can go to the second slide there. Jen has the controlling of the slides. And yes, this will be available later on. I saw that question pop up. So if you do need to cut out early, feel free, this will be posted later. And feel free to ask your questions ahead of time so they'll get answered in the video. So why set objectives? A lot of people inherently know, I think maybe subconsciously, maybe not, that they have some goals for the land when they buy it or they inherit it. But they may not be able to really put those down in words. A lot of times they'll get developed as you do more management activities. But so why do I own land? Did I inherit the land? Did I purchase it? Or is there some other way that the land came to be in the possession of the owner? Another big one that impacts the objective is, do I reside on that land? Is my house there? Am I looking out my back window at my woodlot? Or am I an out-of-state owner or a few towns over? Those things certainly impact what your management goals are, because you're oftentimes not available to see what's going on. You might have neighbors that help you with those types of things, but it may impact other decisions, like maybe putting up a gate or some cameras and things like that, or even posting the land. That's been a topic of discussion as of late for quite a few people. Other aspects that would impact forest management. So those are a variety of things, and we can get into those a little bit more, but that might include perhaps invasive plants on the property, or documented threatened or endangered species. Do you know that there's something that is important, that it's rare? Is there significant habitat on the property? Has the state designated maybe some inland wading bird or waterfowl habitat on the property? Those things should come to mind when you're thinking about the lot, because those are unique. Not all properties have those types of things, and they ought to have an asterisk next to them when you're considering what you're doing with your land, because you have an opportunity to either promote better habitat for certain species, or just manage in a unique way that others may not have that opportunity because they don't have that certain feature on their land. Are there conditions or other things on the property that would impact other properties around me? This is an interesting one. I've run into a few of these where, in fact, right now, I'll tell you a little bit of a story. I'm working in Hollis, and we're working on the property of an old chicken factory, egg factory. And one of the properties we're working on has an area where they would dump hen manure. It's about 20 acres in size. And that new owner was not completely aware that had been the history of the property. And in fact, it's not too far from a very well-known stream, and had caused some nutrient issues in that stream over time. So there's a number of monitoring wells on the property that the owner wasn't aware of. And so these are things that can come to light that really impact what you do with the land, how it impacts others around you. Others would obviously be invasive plants. I don't mean to continue on that, but certainly if you have a seed source, or your neighbor has a seed source, and you're really aggressively trying to control to keep exotic invasive plants off your property, but just over that stone wall is, a bittersweet 30 feet high, it's going to come into your management objectives long term of how to work with that in the landscape setting. So on to the next slide. Getting into why we own land. I believe the Maine Forest Service did a study on this not too long ago, and Tom Doak would be the one to really elaborate on that. But there's a variety of reasons, and they've shifted over time. A lot of people used to own forest land for the purpose of timber and producing commercial timber. And Obviously, if you're in tree growth, that has to be, by definition, your number one objective, but that doesn't mean you can't work towards other things in conjunction with that. But oftentimes people own it as a wildlife sanctuary. They want to be able to take walks on their property and see wildlife. They want privacy. It could be part of a family forest or maybe a legacy forest that's been in the family for generations. Others enjoy hunting, a variety of recreation, hiking, cross-country skiing, snowshoeing. It's less often a financial asset for those who do purchase land, because the value of trees hasn't exactly skyrocketed like many other products we've seen as of late. But oftentimes I find, certainly down in this part of the state, southern Maine, it came with the house. People will buy a property and there's 15 or 20 acres of forest land attached to it, and they don't quite think about it. And that makes sense. People are busy, and they may be more focused on the home than the land. So later in life, they start to look at the forest land and think more about it and what they can do with it. Next slide. So getting back to conditions of the property, I find this, acknowledging what the conditions are and understanding those conditions really helps focus in what your objectives can be. So I threw a couple pictures in here. The picture on the far left is a property I'd worked on where there was a significant amount of blowdown on it. And that can become an issue for landowners regardless of what stage that is in, whether it's just downed wood that's decaying, or if it's a recent weather event that has a number of uprooted trees, and that can change things quickly. So the middle picture is a property in Scarborough that I've worked on. It's pretty heavily infested with bittersweet and multiflora rose and buckthorn. You can see there's a large vine right in the center going up that main tree. So it's a different starting point for somebody like this who can't really even think about managing a forest until they really get that one factor under control, that factor being the invasive plant population. So there's oftentimes glaring things in the forest that need to be considered before other management goals can be reached. The far picture I threw in on the far right there is a white pine stand. If you can see right at the bottom, there is a feller buncher at the very bottom underneath all of that. But this is a generation family forest. I believe it's on third or fourth generation, where they've gotten past a lot of the smaller goals to work on some larger long-term goals where they've really been managing for quite some time. On to the next one. So we had a question here. I want to see what that was. Curious how to find a logger on the mid-coast to best align with my objectives. Should I limit search to mid-coast, or is this radius for loggers broader? And are there other lists aside from or better than the CLP list on the SWAM website? That's a good question. We'll get to that here in a little bit, because it's certainly something that is important to talk about. So getting back to what people enjoy in their woods activities, what do you do in your woods? This impacts how you manage it and how you take care of it. Obviously, the aesthetics of maybe a timber harvest or a certain silvicultural prescription, something a forester would recommend you do, may not necessarily suit what your activities are. So oftentimes people just observe nature. They enjoy snowshoeing, cross-country skiing, hiking, camping, hunting, fishing, growing Christmas trees, doing maple syrup this time of year especially, foraging, which is a more recent one that I've run into, and cutting your own firewood for personal use. Those are pretty common activities in the woods that you want to consider and think about when it comes to putting together a list of your goals. Next slide. Another factor that should work into this is what types of equipment do you own? How comfortable are you getting out into your woods and using tools? cutting trees. Is that something you're really working towards? Are you going to put in some effort and some sweat equity to really improve your forest long term, or is that something you're going to leave towards professionals? And this runs the gamut. I meet all kinds of woodland owners, and I'm actually often surprised by how many really want to get in the woods and work their forest and help improve it. Not to say that they wouldn't have a commercial harvest at some point or already have, but they like to do some supplemental management of maybe thinning saplings or other things, of just maybe cutting firewood for release of other certain trees. So next slide. Other considerations, I'm thinking about objectives. How many people use the woodlot? And this varies across the state. Down here in southern Maine, there is pretty heavy impact, or not impact. There's quite a bit of people that use private woodlands because they only own 2 or 3 acres, and the larger tracts of land are privately held around them. So who uses it? Family, friends, public? Is the land open for public use? Do you want it to be open for public use? Is it not posted? Have you considered? And what would be the reason for it? Is there ways you can keep the land open and work with the public to make sure that the land is left in good condition and still allow public use for that land? Other things, are there abutting properties that pose an impact negatively or positively? And this is an interesting one. It's something some people often don't think about. They think about their boundary and that's it. Beyond that, they don't put much thought in it. And one thing I've found, or a few things I've found that have a large impact on woodland owners, are large housing developments of small lots. So a large number of houses in a small area along a boundary line. They're doing a lot more cluster subdivisions in Maine, where they keep small house lots and then have a common land area inside of that housing development. So that can certainly impact your property, whether people are dumping yard clippings or creating trails on your property from abutting lands, things like that. Conservation land. Do you abut conservation land? Do you abut tree growth property? Do you abut a land trust that has a trail system where the public is walking along your land? Maybe limits what you can do with your property because there is an impact on that edge. Do you live next to a shooting range? This one has come up more recently in a number of different areas, but or a gravel pit, often used as shooting range, illegally or not so, but or a working gravel pit where you're listening to dump trucks all day. And think about how you could create a more sound buffer against that, or maybe a cattle farm. There's a number of different things that impact you and your woodlot. And the cattle farm's an interesting one because the state had studied non-point source pollution. And so thinking about that, you often think about that the upland forests and wetlands, forested wetlands are some of the best filters for that type of nutrient runoff, and how that impacts your woodlot if it flows through it, or if you're on the higher part of that watershed and it's down below you, and what you can do to improve that water. Excuse my fussy Labrador retriever here. She's whining. Next slide. Another thing that, you'll eventually come to if you own forest land is if you want to commercially harvest. And this is a big one because there's a lot of steps that go into planning a harvest and executing a harvest properly to meet your objectives. There's a number of different ways it can happen. But first and foremost, your objectives ought to be the driving force behind it, along with maybe a recommendation from a forester, and talk through those recommendations and your goals to make sure you get what you want out of a timber harvest. But I often find that when it comes to planning a harvest and talking about objectives for a harvest, sometimes it takes a couple of years to actually get equipment on the ground and cutting wood, just to make sure that everybody's on the same page, because you can't stand the trees back up. So once you start that type of work, you're you're committed as far as what's been cut. So the picture on this slide, I just threw this in. This is a property I worked on down in Hollis. The upper picture is the before. It was a nice stand of white pine, but there was a number of hard maple, or excuse me, red maple, soft maple mixed throughout. And we did a thinning to focus on a white pine shelter wood. The goal here was purely regenerate white pine and create habitat. Sorry, my dog has found her toy. So the bottom picture is the end result of that harvest. This is not 2 or 3 days after the wood was skidded away. So it's pretty new. It looks really open. But ultimately the goal here is to create a 2-age stand where you have a new stand of regeneration developing. And we'll fill up that understory over time. So aesthetically it will change. You won't have long viewing alleys or corridors in your woodlot. It'll be much shorter. Next slide. This picture I threw in just because it's another one of a before and after when it comes to talking about and thinking about harvesting and goals. This is taken from the exact same spot. And something I like to do on timber harvest to over time find a picture tree and flag it and take pictures in cardinal directions as time changes to see what that looks like and help really focus on long-term goals and maybe aesthetics of the lot. But this is, again, just a white pine shelter wood with a trail intersecting there through the middle of skid trail. Next one. So when it comes time to organizing objectives around harvesting, the most important thing is to have a conversation with maybe the family or the managers of the property. Talk about types of harvesting systems. Talk about what type of wood's being cut. What are the products? What are the bulk of the products? And this is often discussed with a forester. He should be able to tell you what the bulk of the products are that are going to be harvested to suit your objectives. And I often try and focus the harvesting equipment around the products being harvested, but also in conjunction with the recreation that's done on the property. So this is a whole tree mechanized system. It's probably the most common at this point, I would say. The upper left is a feller buncher. To the right, well, upper left is feller buncher. That's what cuts the trees. The bottom right is the skidder. Grapple skidder drags the trees out whole with the tops and limbs attached. The upper right is a slasher that delimbs the tree and then chops the top off and cuts the product to length. And then also I threw in a picture of a chipper because oftentimes those tops are piled behind the slasher and fed into a chipper for biomass. And this type of harvesting requires a fairly large landing, most of the time a half an acre. So you have to have that type of area on your property to be cleared in order to utilize this type of equipment. You have to be willing to give up a half an acre of area to be open and easily accessible from the roadside or have a road built into that landing area. You can keep them pretty small if you don't require a truck turnaround on the property. If trucks can back into the property, you can limit the size, maybe being 50 by 75, probably at the smallest. So these are the considerations I often bring up to landowners when talking about objectives is how these different systems will impact the property. One benefit of a whole tree mechanized is you get what's called scarification of your soils. You often get that organic material, the organic layer in your soil turned over a little bit, roughed up. And that helps propagate new seedlings in the future, especially when you cut in the summertime or fall. And you'll have better results oftentimes if you have a little bit of soil, not disturbance, but scarification. On to the next slide. So this is one that's become more popular as of late. with advancements in technology and harvest systems and computer systems. It's called cut to length. It's called that because the tree is cut at the stump. The machine in the upper right-hand corner is the machine doing that. It cuts it at the stump, it turns it over, it delimbs it, and then bucks it into products right at the stump in the forest, which is a bit unique. And then it's picked up by the machine on the bottom there called a forwarder, and that wood is carried out to the landing and stacked on usually a linear landing with wood just stacked on both sides, oftentimes a road in some cases. One thing to consider with this type of system is you often have a lot more slash in the forest. A lot of those limbs that are taken off of the log are left right in the trail, and the machinery runs it over and breaks it down. So it's often not good for recreation. If you want to have like a woods trail you can use your four-wheeler on or your tractor after the harvest to go out and do activities in the forest, it makes it considerably difficult because you'll have a bunch of slash in that wood in that trail, and it's a nightmare to walk on. It's ankle breaking material. So that's one thing to consider when you're doing a harvest, is how recreation does work into that. The other thing about this is the wood is not skidded. It's actually carried out, so there is less impact. I've had some cut to length operators put their slash on the sides of the trails. If the soil is dry and arid and rutting is not a concern, you end up with much less disturbance in that case, and cleaner wood, obviously, but sometimes a better trail also. It's just it depends whether or not the forester and the landowner and the logger are all talking to each other and identifying trails that you don't want slash on, what's most important to you, where are your main trails, where do you want your main trails, things like that. If those conversations aren't had ahead of time, then oftentimes you won't have a result that you're happy with. The next slide. So this is traditional. When you think about logging, you think about cable skidding. This was really popular up until, I would say, the mid 90s or so. Maybe not that late, but there's quite a few cable loggers still around. They will cut the tree at the stump. They will limb the tree and cut off the top and just take it out as a pole attached to the skidder. A unique thing about a cable skidder is that you can work off the edges of embankments by just running that cable out and pulling the wood up to the machine versus the machine having to go to the tree. So you can have shorter trails, you can have longer sections of area that are harvested without actual machinery on the ground. It's less common these days due to insurance and the wood markets. There's not a great market for the low grade material for somebody like that. So these are the most common types. The next slide is more of a wish for most than reality. There are a few people still doing horse logging. It is more of a hobby for those who do it at this point, as I've found. There's a few guys down here that do it, but it's not very popular because it doesn't earn you much money as the logger. But a lot of people like the idea of it, like they like the history of it. But I would say that a good cable skidder could do just as good a job as a horse. So these are important things. I only bring this up because it's really important to know what you'd be inviting onto your property to do work when thinking about your objectives, and think ahead of time how you want the outcome to be. What do you want it to look like? And think about what's most important to you, and have that factor drive maybe what harvest system you use on the property. So going back to that question that was asked, let me pull the chat up here. So Chris said, how to find a logger in the mid-coast area best aligned with my objective. Should I limit my search to mid-coast region? My answer to you, Chris, is yes. Oftentimes loggers work within, I would say, probably a 20 to 50 mile radius. Some work far further, but those people will know the site conditions of your area. They will know the good markets in your area. And and they will likely have a reputation in the area that you can ask others about. And one thing I tell landowners to do if they have the time and willingness is to go look at timber harvests of that contractor that they're considering. Go out and take a walk on a job that they recently did. You can look further for other loggers. You'll find that whole tree mechanized loggers, the larger systems, travel further because they require more wood to keep their operation moving, whereas cable loggers don't have quite the high production, so they will oftentimes stay closer to home. I think getting in the second part of your question, where to find a logger. Oftentimes you can talk to other woodland owners. A forester is a great resource for that. A lot of foresters will have certain loggers that they really like to use. And just as a pitch, I'd encourage you to use a forester to help implement a harvest for you if you're considering it. Forester rates are negotiable. A lot of people don't know, but you can ask a forester what they charge, how they charge, and would they be willing to charge less, despite what you might think. Will you be covering trail marking on other topics not related to timber harvesting? Doug, can you elaborate when you mean trail marking? Do you mean just maybe laying out trails, or what to consider when doing that? Trail making. Oh, excuse me, trail making. There's no, I wasn't exactly going to cover it, but one thing I will bring up that is maybe not what you're getting to, but when it comes to harvest systems, a lot of people utilize the trails left behind by those. And the first system I showed, the whole tree mechanized system, is usually laid out in like a wishbone fashion. If you look at Google Earth or aerial imagery, you'll see all those trails lead back to the landing in a wishbone or fishbone style. Oftentimes not great for recreation because the trails just end, they don't go anywhere. Whereas cut to length systems don't need to skid in any certain direction because the wood is all cut 16 feet or shorter and put on the forwarder. So they can do loop style trail systems. They can do whatever trail system that you'd like to be laid out on the property. And if you don't have a trail system already, utilizing a cut to length system is a great way to develop one. And then again, cable skidding is the same. They're going to be the fishbone style of trail system. And I encourage people to establish a trail system that you're going to continually use. This ranges between foresters. Some foresters will use different trails in different areas because they want regeneration in their trails, new saplings to develop, and then they'll set their trail over into a different area. So anybody have any questions or any comments or anything they want to bring up when it comes to setting objectives or meeting objectives?
Jeff, earlier you spoke about invasive species and how that might change an approach or certainly shape an approach early on. Any additional commentary or on that topic?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I'm glad you brought that up. If you know you have invasive plants on your property and you want to do something about them, it's starting as soon as you can is best. The state has come up with a slogan, early detection, rapid response is their mantra. Find them when they're young and pull them out when they're small and easily pulled. The thing about invasive plants is if left alone, oftentimes they're just going to get worse. And with natural disturbance or human impact, i.e. logging or any kind of development or anything, they're going to spread to any new soil that you disturb. So identifying them and knowing where they are and maybe working around them or working to contain them depending on how bad they are. I encourage landowners often to treat prior to a harvest or any other soil disturbance activity, and then do a follow-up afterwards. But that doesn't always make the most sense. If you have a really bad infestation, like this one I worked on I forget what town it was, but there was bittersweet in a red pine plantation. And the red pine had Serococcus shoot blight, a pathogen that kills the pine over time. And it had bittersweet crawling up that pine. So instead of treating the bittersweet to go in and clear cut the red pine, we decided we'll just go clear cut the red pine because that was the prescription for the property. It wasn't going to last. It was on its way out. And then we'll treat the bittersweet that comes up after because it'll be far less herbicide. It'll be significantly cheaper. And you'll have a better result as of doing that. So it's something that works into almost every part of your objective because it also affects wildlife habitat. It's negatively impacting. If you look towards Connecticut, there's been studies done that say invasive plants have led to increased tick populations and therefore higher rates of Lyme disease. They found that field mice and small rodents and even rabbits will carry ticks in those real dense thickets of like Japanese barberry, honeysuckle, and bittersweet. And the predators just can't get into that real dense understory. So the tick populations will soar in those areas. So it's an interesting topic because it really, if you come up with an objective for your property, there's probably some way that invasive plants will play a role if they're present on the lot. And it's something in southern Maine I deal with on almost every property. I think 1 out of 10 doesn't have invasives at this point.
Great, thank you.
Sure. I think also, just to bring it up, I don't know that other chapters will be doing it, but I think Southern Maine, we're going to try and do an outdoor invasive event sometime either midsummer or late summer, looking at some really bad infestations and what they can look like if treated.
Yeah, well, we can let people know about that through our newsletter and email blast. Tom Allen.
Yeah, Jeff, I'd like to ask a question about if you've got a property. The property we have in Sebago is mostly pine and oak and a fair bit of beech, some of it diseased. And I'm wondering, one of my goals would be to create habitat for birds, for critters of all kinds. And how would the choices that you have for type of equipment, what type of cutting, I mean, how can you talk generally about what makes sense if you're trying to enhance, among your other goals, forest habitat? What would you recommend?
The first thing I would consider is what time of year do you cut? That has a real big impact on what you have for regeneration, meaning what species come back. So if you decide to harvest in the summertime, you oftentimes don't have completely mature seed. So what you have on site isn't necessarily what you'll get back. You'll have more disturbance in the soil, so you will have better stems per acre overall. You just may not have the desired composition. If you cut in the late summer, early fall to late fall, you'll have mature seed. You'll get real good scarification. You'll get more pine, oak, maple. You'll get the later successional species oftentimes if you cut in the late summer. So you'll regenerate more pine, oak. You'll get more maple, sugar maple, yellow birch, eastern hemlock. Whereas if you cut in the wintertime and you have a real heavy snowpack, you will likely get more red maple, aspen, birch, cherry, those pioneer species, the early successionals. And the reason for that is you get the seed production. Those seeds are so small. One aspen can produce up to 1 million seeds. And once we get that frost on the snow, they'll travel for miles. And so those will likely be deposited prior to anything else. So those will be the first to germinate. And without scarification, you don't really get that oak or pine seed set down in the soil as it needs to be. So I think timing is most critical. And I know I'm just talking about tree species, but ultimately that's what forms the habitat. So I often ask people what they're focused on when it comes to wildlife or just wildlife in general, if it's species specific, if it's birds, if it's ground dwelling mammals, it's a variety of things, but to have just an amalgamation of wildlife in general and to manage for it, the best thing you can do is have multi-layered stands. You have your understory, and forestry for the birds, the program they put on is great for this. They tell you to look at your lot and just put out 3 fingers and kind of stare off into the distance and see if you have tree canopy in every level of the forest. And having some variety in that, having some hardwood inclusions in a softwood stand, having some softwood inclusions in a hardwood stand, often makes some of the best habitat.
Great, thank you.
Sure. And some people, I've been doing this more and more as of late, but to really get into bird habitat, it's sometimes you need to clear cut some larger areas. We've done some in southern Maine here, as we just did one last week. We did a 19-acre one because there's some songbirds, and I can't list them off the top of my head, but they are niche species where they will not nest or forage in areas that are less than that size of early successional habitat or young forests. And so many times when a clear cut happens, it's a negative connotation to people, but a clear cut happens for a specific reason, whether it be development or something, the land, change of use on the land. You don't quite see clear cutting and then allowing it to revert to forest. You'll see real heavy thinnings or heavy harvests where they try and reach the most they can cut without being a clear cut. But those oftentimes will come back different than an actual clear cut would.
Who else has some questions for Jeff? It's kind of like having a free, an hour of free forestry services, so take full advantage.
Yeah, and objectives is a hard thing to really pin down because it's so individual for each person. But I think just considering as many factors as you can, the Maine Forest Service has a really good questionnaire that you can work through on your own on the Department of Conservation website, where it asks you a number of criteria to answer, and then it helps you really hone in on what you want to get out of the property. I find not many people are managing their woodlots for financial return anymore. That's become less and less, but I do tell them that good management often leads to financial return in the long run. Healthier trees produce better products, higher grade products.
And I think we have that, Jeff, I think we have that list from the Forest Service on our website. So I'm gonna dig for that and put that link
Okay.
in chat.
Great.
What should we do? Russell has a question. What should we do along small, fast flowing streams, steep and shale clay banks, mostly hemlock, doomed probably?
That's a good one. We're in a unique position now that almost every tree in Maine has something that's attacking it. Hemlock, obviously the hemlock woolly adelgid is moving upstream corridors, river corridors in southern Maine. Is it doomed? It remains to be seen. I know down in the South Berwick area, there's been some heavy foliage loss of hemlock stands to the point where it feels like you're in a hardwood stand in the winter when you're in the middle of a dense hemlock stand. So what can you do along those areas? One thing I might consider doing, and this will take some help from the Maine Forest Service or a biologist, is doing some chop and drop into the stream to maybe change the structure of the stream. I'm not a biologist, but I've been to a few seminars on this, and you may have to give up some of your larger hemlock if you don't want to sell it as a log, because size matters when it comes to doing or putting wood into a stream. You do need a permit to do this, so don't just do it on your own. But that would be one thing I would consider to try and change the structure of the stream. You want a variety of pools and ripples and things. And over time you'll get there, but it's not an overnight thing. But that might be something I'd consider. And that'll help you regenerate some other species over time and not just have a single cohort of hemlock that is maybe over mature and doomed long term, so you don't have a riparian buffer on that stream into the future. I will give the state some credit. That's one thing they've really looked at when redoing the shoreline zoning rules, is realizing that single age stream buffers are a recipe for disaster long term, whether it be pathogen or pest that attacks that single stand or single species type.
Jeff, there were a few people who said that they've owned their woods for a while, but they're just starting to manage, or someone who said they own their woods and it's unmanaged. And
Mhm.
what if they came to you knowing they probably have some previous knowledge of their woods? It's not brand new to them. Would you give different advice to people in that situation over people who just bought their woods?
Sometimes, more so than not, I would say, because you often are, if you've owned your woods for a long time, you haven't really done anything to change it much. You haven't done any harvesting. You're pretty comfortable with the way it looks aesthetically. And seeing some real drastic dynamic change in a forest is often unsettling for those owners. They don't like real abrupt change because they're so used to their forest and they know their trails. So I work with those people maybe a little bit differently than somebody who just purchased the land and isn't so attached to how it looks or how it's been, hasn't formed memories around the certain condition. So yeah, I work with those people differently, and I think maybe some lighter management often is the result. But I always go out and walk with people and point out things that I see, and I give them some points to really focus on. Working with a landowner who's owned for a long time but maybe hasn't managed. And oftentimes you'll find that those people, by the time that they're 10 years in, just say, I wish I'd started 20 years earlier, because it's such a slow process when you talk about forest management. Somebody who's older or later in life who's just beginning to manage are often doing work for whoever will inherit it or whoever you'll sell to next. And ultimately, that's really the goal of stewardship, is regardless of the future, you're working to just improve that forest for the sake of doing so.
Chris, jump on in.
Yeah, I'll take myself off mute. Thank you very much. And Jeff, really appreciate the information. This is interesting and helpful. You answered my question with, where do I find a logger, saying start with the forester. So if I were to modify my question, say, where do I find a good forester in the area? Where would you point me?
You can ask, the Maine Forest Service has a district forester for every region of the state. And you can find your district forester on the Maine Forest Service website.
Okay.
They're public servants. They will give you a list of probably up to 5 foresters in your area. They're in no particular order. So be sure to call around. There is a stewardship list of foresters. And I think Jen can probably link that pretty easily. And that list is a great list to start with, because those people are practicing consultants. They've been through stewardship training. They're usually very qualified people, and they know the industry well. You can ask if you don't want to use a forester, no hard feelings, but you can ask the district foresters for the Forest Service to give you some logging contractors as well. Again, they will be in no particular order because they can't show any favoritism. So it may not be somebody you want on your property. I would encourage you again to just do your due diligence. And don't be shy. Don't be shy to ask questions and say, where are you working? Can I stop into your landing right now and come see what it looks like? Because if you ask a logger, say, can I go look at one of your previous jobs? They'll send you to their best one they've done in the last 6 months or a year. They may not show you the one that they had a bridge blowout on or something bad happened. And so, and if you get a strange feeling in your gut when talking to a contractor, don't just set it aside. I'd listen to your gut, and talk to others. Maybe talk to others that are Maine Woodland owner members in your chapter, and don't hesitate to call the office, and ask the office too if they know of good contractors or foresters in the area. Tom or Debbie up in or even Jen will help you along with that also.
Yeah, I got the phone number, our phone number here. I've also been loading the chat with different links, so please use those. because there are a lot of great things out there. And I'll just plug the Maine Forest Service. They really want woodland owners to use their resources. It's kind of the more that's used, the more they, the more they can produce. And they put out some really good things, and it's things that we recommend. Often when people are coming to our office or calling us asking for some advice, we certainly have expertise in the office, and we then send people to their district forester or to the website with where there's resources, because there are some really good options there. So these links will take you there. Our office is always open, and I'll give our phone number and Tom Doak's email. He's a good resource.
One thing I just want to jump in, not to sound like sour grapes or anything, but when you talk to a forester, there's private consulting foresters like myself and others, but there's also a number of foresters who actually are employed by logging contractors. And it's important to know the difference, that a forester employed by a logging contractor is more of a procurement forester. They're not ethically bound to represent you and your objectives. They're paid by the logger, whereas a consultant would be paid directly by you and represent you for the contractor. And that's an important distinction to be made.
We had an article talking about what you should be thinking about before your harvest, as far as Jeff, what you've been discussing, the different types of what type of logging you want, what kind of what are your objectives, and really knowing what you want before you get a logger in there. And I sent a link out. It's our Maine woodland owners new woodland owner page that we've created. And one of the things we do have is a list of foresters that are licensed, and also a link to see information about loggers, so you can do your own research. But the one question that a lot of people forget to ask is of their forester is that, are you obligated, or do you have are you hired by a logging firm? And it's not common, but it can happen, is my understanding. So asking good questions. And Jeff, as a forester, do you hate when people ask lots of questions?
No. No. I often, I might not know the answer, but I'll find the person who does.
Yeah. So a good forester would be okay with you asking lots and lots of questions, because
Sure.
I would imagine that transparency is as important to a good forester as it is to a landowner.
It is, and it's the type of position, it's a unique profession where you often work with generations. I've already worked with generations where the original owner will pass away, and I'm working with the children now. So you become, it's a professional position, but you also become kind of a friend in that way. You work with someone for quite some time. Forestry is slow, and you don't cut wood. You cut maybe every 10 years at the most, maybe a little bit more, but it's something that you really have to be comfortable with the people you're working with to ask those questions and get to the goal of your management.
Fred has his hand up. Go ahead, Fred.
Thank you. So I inherited my land. It's been in the family for like 70 years, I was thinking. But it's really nothing's been done on it other than some firewood cutting back in like the 80s. Mm-hmm. And the lot lines are not well defined, like they're not even marked. So I was just curious, could you give some advice on how to get started with that even?
Where are you located, Fred?
So the land is in Otis.
Otis, okay. One thing you could do, if you don't have a copy of your deed, you can go on the online registry of deeds and download your deed by just searching your last name in the town.
I do have a copy, but it's very vague, and it's like, from this person's land to the next person's land.
Oh, yeah,
like
those are my favorite, to this tree stump.
Yeah.
There are a few other alternative options. I mean, a survey is obviously the best option, but this time of year, recently, it's hard to find somebody who's reasonable. and is not a year out at this point with the real estate market. The other thing I would encourage you to look into is I use an app. I don't rely on it, but it's called OnX Hunt, OnXHUNT.
Okay.
And if you have a smartphone, Android or iPhone, you can download it, and it will bring up parcel data based on what the town has or the state GIS office has. And it will put you in the vicinity of where your boundaries might be. So I don't know if you have a rough idea where they are, if you think you're close or you're a couple hundred yards off. This will help you get in the area. I wouldn't rely on it because oftentimes it's wrong, but it might get you on to finding an old fence line or barbed wire and trees, or maybe some old blazes here and there set apart quite a ways. But I'll oftentimes find some remnants of a line, and then you'll lose it, but I'll take a compass heading on what I find that I can connect on a line and just keep walking and keep looking for evidence, and just going back and forth and trying to stay on a certain compass heading, or if the evidence changes, then resetting. That's been my way of trying to find lines, aside from just walking in circles looking for evidence.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
We have a minute or two. So if someone wants to jump in for a last question or thought. Well, we are always available. I sent out Tom's email. Everybody should have my email at jen@mainwoodlandowners.org, since I have emailed everybody who attended. So please send anything my way if you have questions after this program's over. Jeff's always available as well. So, but send whatever you have to me and I'll get it to Jeff, and he'll be back for another program. Probably on the same lines of these kind of initial planning tools for woodland management, or even maybe we could dig in a little bit more about the relationship between foresters and loggers, and talk about what's expected and best practices in that way.
Sure. We'll have to book a whole day for that one.
Yeah. Maybe.
No, we could certainly do a helpful one on that.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for attending. And again, this
Yes,
is
thank you.
this is going to be on our website, recorded, and we'll have various videos on the same page. We have a video page on our website. So if you missed other programs, you can check that out. We have some programs set up for March, one on the brown-tail moth updates, which is big news at this point because there's been there's proposal for some money to provide more services and support to address the brown-tail moth issue. And then we're going to have Fireside Forestry with Bob Seymour in March as well, which is a very popular program where you basically ask whatever question you have for Bob Seymour, our practical silviculture columnist for our newsletter. So thanks, everyone, and I look forward to seeing everybody very soon. Take care.
Bye-bye.